Edwin Grayson had been the caretaker of Black Hollow Cemetery for nearly 20 years. It was a job passed down through his family for generations, along with an old silver medallion. The medallion, shaped like an ornate shield, hung around Edwin's neck on a leather cord. His father had once told him, "This isn't just jewelry. It's protection. Never take it off." The cemetery itself was quiet most days, with only the rustle of leaves and chirping of birds to keep Edwin company. At night, though, there was an unsettling stillness that seemed to breathe on its own. But as long as he wore the medallion, Edwin never felt afraid. One evening, Edwin returned to his small caretaker's cottage after repairing a broken headstone. He placed the medallion on the table while washing up, a rare lapse in his father's warning. When he returned moments later, it was gone. Edwin searched the cottage frantically, but there was no sign of the medallion. A growing unease settled over him, a prickling at the back of his neck. That night, as he lay in bed, he was jolted awake by a searing pain in his chest. Suddenly, he wasn't in his room anymore. He stood in a dark forest, the air thick with smoke. A woman screamed in the distance, her cries cutting through the night like a knife. Edwin tried to move toward her, but his legs felt like lead. He saw the flash of an axe and heard the sickening crunch of wood. Or was it bone? He awoke in a cold sweat, gasping for air. His chest throbbed, and his hands shook as he lit the lantern by his bed. The experience had felt so real, but it was just a dream, wasn't it? The next night, the vision came again. This time, Edwin stood on the banks of a river. A young man struggled against unseen hands dragging him below the surface. Edwin tried to shout, but his voice was swallowed by the rushing water. He could feel the chill of the river creeping up his own legs, and then, nothing. When he woke, he knew these weren't ordinary dreams. They were memories, memories of the dead buried in Black Hollow Cemetery. Over the next week, the visions grew more vivid, more horrifying. Edwin saw a farmer crushed beneath his own plow, a child trapped in a burning house, a woman thrown from a cliff. Each night, he awoke feeling the weight of their suffering. Desperate for answers, Edwin searched the cemetery records. To his shock, the people from his visions were all buried there. But the dates didn't add up. Most had died over a century ago, and yet their deaths had never been recorded as natural or accidental. Then he found it, a weathered ledger hidden at the back of an old desk. Its pages detailed payments made to someone simply called the warden. The sums were large, the entries frequent, and the notes chilling. Silence secured for William Hargrove. No questions about Mary's fall. Jacob drowned, as agreed. The truth hit Edwin like a blow. The cemetery was more than a resting place, it was a dumping ground for secrets. His ancestors, the caretakers, had been complicit in covering up murders for the town's wealthy elite. The spirits weren't haunting Black Hollow because they couldn't rest. They were trapped, their deaths silenced by greed and corruption. And the medallion? It had shielded Edwin from their wrath, keeping the truth buried. But now the medallion was gone, and Edwin was vulnerable. That night, the visions were worse than ever. The spirits didn't just show him their deaths. They reached for him, their cold hands pulling him into their memories. He could feel their anger, their pain, their demand for justice. As dawn broke, Edwin made a decision. He couldn't undo the past, but he could reveal the truth. He gathered the ledger and every record he could find, determined to expose the cemetery's dark history. But as he stepped outside, he froze. The cemetery gates were wide open, and standing in the mist were the spirits, their hollow eyes fixed on him. "I'm sorry." Edwin whispered, clutching the ledger tightly. I'll make it right. The spirits didn't speak, but their presence pressed against him, heavy and cold. One by one, they faded back into the mist, leaving Edwin to face the weight of the curse, and the task of breaking it. The road through the mountain range was supposed to be scenic, but as the sun dipped below the peaks, shadows stretched long across the landscape. A group of 5 college friends, Emily, Jake, Sarah, Mike, and Lisa, were road tripping to a music festival in the next state. Their GPS directed them to a tunnel that seemed to cut through the heart of the mountains. "This'll save us an hour," Jake said, steering the van toward the dark opening. As the van entered the tunnel, the warm glow of the sunset disappeared, replaced by the cold, artificial flicker of overhead lights. The tunnel stretched straight ahead, a perfect, unbroken line. At first, the mood was light. They played music, joked, and talked about the festival. But as minutes turned into half an hour, a strange silence fell over the group. "Shouldn't we be out of here by now?" Sarah asked, her voice uneasy. "It's just a long tunnel," Jake replied, though his grip on the wheel tightened. Emily checked the GPS. The screen displayed nothing, just a blinking dot on a blank map. She frowned and refreshed the app, but it stayed the same. "Guys, this isn't right," she said, her voice shaking. Jake glanced at the odometer. "We've been driving for over 20 miles. There's no way a tunnel is this long." The group grew tense. The tunnel remained unchanging, its walls the same dull gray, the lights above flickering in a steady rhythm. Then Sarah screamed. "What? What is it?" Lisa asked, panicking. Sarah pointed out the window. "I saw something. A face. In the wall." They all looked, but the smooth concrete revealed nothing. "You're just tired," Mike said, though his voice lacked conviction. But soon, they all began noticing strange things. The air felt thicker, heavier, as if it were pressing down on them. The tunnel walls seemed to pulse, like they were alive. And then there were the whispers, faint and unintelligible, but unmistakable, coming from somewhere deep in the tunnel. The van's radio crackled, the static morphing into a distorted version of a song they'd been listening to earlier. It sounded slower, warped, and eerily familiar. "Turn it off," Lisa said, covering her ears. Jake pressed the power button, but the radio didn't stop. The whispers grew louder, blending with the warped music. Then the changes began. Mike, usually the easygoing joker of the group, grew hostile, snapping at everyone for no reason. Lisa, the most optimistic among them, started muttering dark, cryptic phrases under her breath. Emily became convinced they were being followed, constantly looking over her shoulder. "Something's wrong with us," Sarah whispered, tears streaming down her face. "We need to get out of here." Jake floored the accelerator, but the tunnel stretched endlessly ahead. As time passed, or perhaps stood still, the group's memories began to blur. They couldn't remember where they were headed or why they were even in the van together. Sarah insisted she didn't know any of them. Mike claimed the van wasn't his, though he'd been the one to rent it. The tunnel began to shift. The walls rippled like water, and the flickering lights now cast shadows that moved on their own. "Stop the van," Emily screamed. "We need to go back." Jake slammed on the brakes. The van skidded to a stop, and for a moment, there was silence. "We should walk," Lisa said, her voice eerily calm. "The tunnel wants us to leave the van behind. Don't listen to her," Sarah whispered, clutching Emily's arm. "That's not Lisa anymore." The group erupted into chaos, their paranoia consuming them. Mike lunged for the door, insisting they had to run, while Jake and Sarah tried to hold him back. Emily screamed, covering her ears as the whispers became deafening. Then, in an instant, the van's headlights illuminated a massive, jagged door ahead. It looked ancient, carved with symbols none of them recognized. "That's the exit," Jake said, his voice shaking. "We just have to get through." But as the van approached, the door began to close. The group shouted, urging Jake to drive faster. The van shot through the narrowing gap, the door slamming shut behind them with a deafening boom. They emerged into blinding sunlight, skidding to a stop on the side of a mountain road. For a moment, no one spoke. The memories of the tunnel felt like a distant dream, but the fear lingered. Emily glanced at the GPS. They were back on the main highway, just a few miles from the festival. But something was wrong. I don't remember my parents' faces," she whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks. One by one, they realized pieces of their memories were gone, important fragments of who they were, lost to the tunnel. As they drove away in silence, a faint whisper echoed through the van's radio. "See you again soon." High on a hill in a quiet coastal town stood WXCR, a small radio station known for playing late-night jazz and reading local news. For years, the station had been the heartbeat of the town, a comforting hum in the background of people's lives. Late one night, as a storm howled over the ocean, Peter, the night DJ, leaned back in his chair, spinning an old record. The flickering light of the studio lamps matched the rhythm of the storm outside. It was past midnight when the radio crackled with static, drowning out the music. Peter frowned, adjusting the dials. "That's odd," he muttered. The interference wasn't unusual during storms, but this time, the static faded into something chilling. A faint voice, barely audible. "Mayday. Mayday. This is the SS Arcadia. We are lost. Coordinates unknown. Please respond." Peter froze. His fingers hovered over the microphone as he listened. The voice was weak and distorted, as though coming from an old recording. "This is WXCR," Peter said hesitantly. "We received your message. Can you repeat your coordinates?" Static crackled, and then, "Storm? Damage, no survivors." The signal cut out. Peter sat in stunned silence, his heart pounding. He recognized the name SS Arcadia. It was an infamous ship that had vanished nearly 50 years ago during a powerful storm, presumed lost with all hands. But how could its radio signal be transmitting now? Peter played the recording back, goosebumps rising as he realized it sounded fresh, not degraded by time. He quickly called his colleague Clara, a history enthusiast who often helped with local mysteries. "Peter, this is crazy," Clara said when she arrived at the studio, her raincoat dripping water onto the floor. "The Arcadia disappeared decades ago. That signal can't be real." "It came through on the emergency frequency," Peter insisted. "I didn't imagine it." Clara glanced at the equipment, then back at Peter. "There's only one way to know for sure. We need to investigate." The next morning, with the storm subsiding, the two rented a small fishing boat from a local captain. Using the radio equipment and coordinates they'd pieced together from the fragmented signal, they set out into the misty expanse of the Atlantic. Hours passed as they navigated the choppy waters. Just as they began to lose hope, a shadow loomed on the horizon. A massive ship, its silhouette ghostly in the fog. "That can't be," Clara whispered. The ship was unmistakably the SS Arcadia. Its hull was rusted, and its once proud name was barely legible. The vessel floated silently, as though trapped in time. Peter and Clara climbed aboard, their footsteps echoing on the metal deck. The ship was eerily silent, its corridors dark and damp. There were no signs of life, no crew, no passengers. Yet the air felt heavy, as if the ship itself was alive. They found the bridge, where an old radio transmitter sat, its dials cracked and wires frayed. "This shouldn't be working," Clara said, running her fingers over the dusty controls. Suddenly, the transmitter crackled to life. A familiar voice emerged. "Mayday. Mayday. This is the SS Arcadia. Lost. No survivors." Peter and Clara stared at each other, fear gripping them. The voice was identical to the one they'd heard at the station. But then it changed, deepening into something unnatural. "You shouldn't have come," it growled. The ship groaned, its structure shuddering. Doors slammed shut, and the faint sound of footsteps echoed through the halls. "We need to leave," Clara yelled. They sprinted back to the deck, but the fog had thickened, obscuring their boat. The Arcadia seemed to shift beneath them, its corridors stretching impossibly, leading them in circles. In one room, they found a wall covered in faded photographs and newspaper clippings, images of the Arcadia's crew and passengers. At the center was a recent photo of WXCR's studio, with Peter and Clara inside. "This doesn't make sense," Peter whispered, his voice shaking. Suddenly, the whispers began. Low at first, then rising into a cacophony of voices, each one crying out for help. Shadowy figures emerged, their forms flickering like static. They reached for Peter and Clara, their eyes hollow, their hands cold as the grave. "You must stay," the voices pleaded. "Complete the broadcast." Peter grabbed Clara's hand, pulling her toward the deck. They stumbled through the fog, finally finding their boat. As they pushed away from the ship, the figures lined the railing, watching in silence. Back at the studio, they played the recording for experts, but no one could explain it. When they returned to the coordinates the next day, the Arcadia was gone. Peter and Clara never spoke of their experience again, but late at night, WXCR's equipment would sometimes crackle to life. And in the static, they swore they could still hear the whispers of the SS Arcadia, calling out for someone to answer their final broadcast. The small town of Hollowbrook lay nestled between towering mountains, far from the bustling cities and the noise of the world. It was a quiet place where everyone knew everyone, and the nights were always cold and still. But this year, things felt different. This year, there was a sense of unease in the air, as if the very land was holding its breath. The townspeople had heard the stories, the legends passed down through generations, of a ritual that took place once every 100 years. A ritual tied to the blood moon, a rare and terrifying event when the moon turned a deep crimson red, casting an eerie glow over the land. They had all heard the warnings, but they never truly believed it would happen again. That was until this year. The sky was growing darker by the hour, and a strange silence fell over Hollowbrook as the blood moon began to rise. It was a moon like no other, its red glow casting long shadows over the town and making the trees look like twisted shapes, their branches reaching out like claws. The people gathered in their homes, locking doors and windows, their hearts heavy with fear, knowing that the time for the ritual was near. In the town's only tavern, a man named Thomas sat nervously at the bar. He had heard the old stories all his life, but he had always dismissed them as superstition. After all, it had been 100 years since the last blood moon, and no one had been sacrificed then. The elders had promised that the ritual would never return. But tonight, something felt wrong. There was a coldness in the air, a tension that made his skin crawl. He could feel it deep in his bones, the ancient magic stirring in the night. "Have you heard?" a voice whispered beside him. Thomas turned to find Sarah, a woman who had lived in Hollowbrook all her life. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. She looked as though she hadn't slept in days. "I've heard the stories," Thomas said, his voice unsteady. "But they're just stories, right?" Sarah shook her head. "No, Thomas. This is real. The ritual is happening tonight. They're going to summon them. The creatures." "The creatures?" Thomas asked, feeling his heart beat faster. "Yes," Sarah whispered. "The creatures from the deep, the ones that feed on fear and flesh. The ones who come when the blood moon rises. They've been waiting for this night for 100 years. And they will take their payment." Thomas felt a chill run down his spine. He had heard vague mentions of creatures from the old tales, but he had never believed them. Creatures that lived in the shadows, in the deep places of the earth, bound by a pact made long ago by the town's ancestors. A pact that required a sacrifice, a life given to the creatures in exchange for peace, prosperity, and protection for the town. But the pact was broken, and the creatures had been forgotten, left to slumber in the dark corners of the world. "Who's going to be the sacrifice?" Thomas asked, his voice barely a whisper. "They're choosing tonight," Sarah said. "They always choose one. A life to give to the creatures, to pay for the peace the town has enjoyed all these years." Just then, the door to the tavern slammed open, and in walked an old man, hunched and trembling. His clothes were tattered, his face lined with age and worry. "The moon is rising," the man said, his voice shaking. "It's time. It's time for the ritual." Everyone in the tavern fell silent, fear creeping into their eyes. The blood moon was fully in the sky now, its red light spilling through the windows, casting an unnatural glow over everything. The old man shuffled forward, his eyes wide and frantic. "They'll come for someone tonight," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "The ritual cannot be stopped. It's been written in the stars, in the blood of our ancestors. One must be sacrificed, or we will all pay the price." Thomas felt a lump form in his throat. He had heard the old man's words before, but hearing them now, with the blood moon hanging above them, made them feel all too real. The stories, the warnings, everything that had seemed like nonsense to him just hours ago now felt like a nightmare coming true. Outside, the wind picked up, and the sky seemed to darken even further. A low, distant growl echoed through the air, like the sound of something ancient and hungry stirring from its long slumber. "We have to stop this," Thomas said, standing up, his heart racing. "There must be a way to stop the ritual." Sarah grabbed his arm, her eyes wide with fear. "You can't stop it. No one can. It's already begun." As if to confirm her words, a loud, terrifying scream echoed through the streets. It was the kind of scream that made your blood run cold, the kind that no human should ever make. The sound of pain and fear, mixed with something darker, something unnatural. Thomas's heart pounded in his chest as he ran toward the door, his feet carrying him toward the sound. Sarah grabbed his arm, but he pulled away. "Stay here," he said. "I have to help. I have to do something." Outside, the town square was empty, the streets eerily quiet. But in the center of the square, something moved. Shadows twisted and writhed, like smoke rising from the ground. And in the middle of it all, there was a figure, tall, cloaked in darkness, its face hidden beneath a hood. The figure stood with its arms outstretched, chanting in a language Thomas didn't understand, the words seeming to vibrate in the air around him. Suddenly, the ground shook, and a deep rumble echoed through the town. The shadows parted, and something emerged, a creature, its eyes glowing red, its body twisted and unnatural. It moved with a strange grace, as if it were part of the very darkness itself. The figure in the center of the square stopped chanting and turned toward Thomas. The hood fell back, revealing a pale, gaunt face, a face that had been twisted by time and dark magic. "You shouldn't have come," the figure said, its voice cold and cruel. "The ritual is already in motion. The creatures are coming, and the price must be paid." Thomas tried to step back, but his legs felt like they were frozen to the ground. He watched, helpless, as the creature moved toward him, its eyes glowing brighter, its claws extending toward him. The creature paused for a moment, as if it was savoring the fear in the air. It looked around, its eyes scanning the town, searching for its next victim. The red glow of the blood moon bathed the entire scene in an eerie light. "You cannot escape," the figure said. "The blood moon has risen, and the ritual will be completed. One life will be sacrificed, and the creatures will be satisfied, for now." And as the creature lunged toward Thomas, he realized with chilling clarity that the price for Hollowbrook's safety had come at a terrible cost, and that cost would be paid again tonight. The rhythmic clatter of the train's wheels was a lullaby, lulling most passengers into slumber. Outside, the foggy countryside blurred past as the old sleeper train sped through the night. Sarah, sitting by her window, couldn't shake a growing unease. The train was older than she had expected. Its dim lights, worn upholstery, and velvet curtains gave it an air of abandonment. The chill inside wasn't just from the cold night, it seemed to seep from the train itself. Around 2 a.m., as Sarah stared into the darkened corridor, a shadow flitted by. It wasn't human, too thin, too elongated, moving with an unnatural speed. Her heart raced as it disappeared around the corner. Was it a trick of the light? The train groaned as though alive. A soft creaking sound began, deliberate and rhythmic, closer than the train's usual movements. It transformed into tapping, steady, deliberate, inching closer. Gathering courage, Sarah peeked into the corridor. It was empty, but at its far end, the shadow lingered, motionless. "Hello?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The shadow twitched, then slid around the corner, out of sight. Panic gripped her. She hurried toward the conductor's office, hoping for an explanation, but halfway there, she heard it, a faint, melodic humming. The sound came from the back of the train, drawing her in. It was soothing but deeply wrong, each note tightening the dread in her chest. At the rear, she found the conductor's office door ajar. The humming stopped. Inside, the room was abandoned, save for a single flickering lantern on the table and a photograph pinned to the wall. The picture showed the same train, decades ago. Passengers in 1930s attire stood on the platform, smiling, except for one figure. A woman in a dark dress, her face veiled. The air grew colder. Sarah froze as recognition dawned. The woman was the one who had been humming. The lantern's light flickered violently, and the walls seemed to bend, the room tilting as though reality itself was warping. The humming returned, louder, closer. Suddenly, Sarah noticed a handwritten note beneath the photograph. Its ink was smeared, the words barely legible, but one phrase stood out: "The last stop is not for the living." Her stomach churned, a cold sweat breaking out on her skin. Then she felt it, a hand, icy and firm, resting on her shoulder. She gasped and spun around, but the room was empty. The shadows along the walls stretched unnaturally, forming shapes, faces, twisted and screaming in silence. The door slammed shut, trapping her in darkness. The temperature plummeted, and shadows swirled, closing in. A whisper, soft and chilling, brushed against her ear. "You should have never boarded the sleeper train." The train screeched to a stop, the sound splitting the silence like a scream. As the train settled, the door creaked open again. This time, the corridor outside wasn't the same. It was lined with dozens of figures, their faces pale and lifeless, their hollow eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. They were dressed in outdated clothing, their expressions frozen in anguish. One by one, their heads turned to face her in unison, their gaze piercing her soul. Sarah tried to scream, but no sound escaped her lips. Among the lifeless faces, she spotted the veiled woman, standing at the far end, her hand raised, pointing at Sarah as though accusing her of something unspeakable.